So what is maladaptive daydreaming? It's a undiagnosable condition where someone gets overly attached to fantasizing or daydreaming. When I say undiagnosable, I mean it hasn't been characterized in places like the DSM, so it's not a standalone condition that people will say that you have, even if you see a professional. But there is plenty of evidence to suggest that it is a thing. It happens with people who have existing mental health disorders or other mental health disorders, but it is likely to also have a standalone trait of its own. It exists on its own as well. So today we're going to be talking about what it is and why it might be damaging to someone to be engaging in maladaptive daydreaming. Hi, I'm Marios. I'm a counselling psychology doctorate living in London. And on this channel, we talk about psychology, mental health, and anything else that I think you'll find interesting or useful. Remember that anything you see on social media is not a replacement for therapy. Okay, so maladaptive daydreaming. First, defining daydreaming. So daydreaming, you'll probably know, is the indulging in fantasizing about things that are not real. They could be based on reality, but they are not reality. So you're not thinking about something that's in front of you particularly. You might be triggered by something that is in front of you, so it acts as the basis of your daydreaming, but the daydreaming is about something that is not real. So a lot of this is starting when you're young. You might be looking outside the window when you're in class because you're bored or want to be distracted from that class, and you look out the window and suddenly, half the class is gone, or maybe the whole is gone. Maybe the teacher noticed, maybe you pulled yourself out of it and you were like, whoa, where did I go? That's daydreaming. I'd say it's slightly different to imagination in that imagination is a bit more deliberate. Like you have to make some effort to imagine something, or to visualize it is another word people use a lot today. Whereas daydreaming is a little bit less deliberate. It just kind of happens. So you might be carried away by daydream. And that's where the whole time sucking element comes in. You don't really know that you've gone into it. You don't know that you're doing it. And then you don't know how much time you have been doing it. So what's so bad about it? Well, actually nothing if it's not maladaptive. Now, this has been studied by Professor Eli Sommer, who is a professor from Haifa University. He has studied how it appears in patients who have psychosis, but also maladaptive daydreaming, and has found that it is something that kind of flies under the radar as something that could be part of psychosis, but it's not, in that it can appear in people who, for example, have OCD. I would say it actually does happen the majority of the time with people with limerence. So if you do have limerence, I would argue you are categorically engaging in maladaptive daydreaming as part of that, but we'll talk about that in a different video. We're just talking about maladaptive daydreaming now. So maladaptive daydreaming is going to be a situation where you become so comforted by the idea of going to that fantasy land. You may consciously do it or not, actually. You may start by doing it unconsciously, most likely, and then it kind of becomes a deliberate type of dissociation, if you've heard of that. So it's a way of pulling yourself away from the experience of the now in order to become safer, more comfortable, maybe even entertained. So that, you can imagine, becomes quite an addictive thing to go to, in that if you know something will alleviate pain, much like a painkiller, you will take it. So if daydreaming becomes that thing that pulls you away from the present moment, which is unpleasant, it starts to become a crux for you. It starts to become something that you resort to in order to alleviate that pain. Now, what do we mean by pain? It can be anything that you're trying to get away from. For a lot of people, it's boredom, and you might see going to social media as being something that pulls you away from the current moment because you're looking for new information, new hits, a story, gossip, anything that might pull you away out of the boredom. And maladaptive daydreaming is very like that, in that once you become bored, subconsciously your mind is trying to alleviate that suffering. So you start to move away. You can think about this when you become distracted. If you sit down to do some homework or some work generally, and you realize that I don't really know how to do this, or I'm worried about what people will think about it, and you suddenly get up and start tidying, or you go to pick up your phone or whatever, like those are ways of coping with the fact that you're stressed. So rather than sit there and be like, okay, what does this mean that I am feeling stressed about this work? Is it because I actually am doubting my abilities, or that my manager is quite critical and I'm afraid of their criticism? That is more directly going to address the problem. But it takes more work than just getting up and moving. And as I said, this is not something you're deliberately doing a lot of the time. You're just getting up because your body knows, hey, if I move away from the computer, I'm going to be less stressed, because right now I'm looking at emails and I'm looking at work, and that stresses me out. This is where the daydreaming comes in. Daydreaming is much easier to pick up, right? You can just start daydreaming whenever. And of course, it happens involuntarily a lot of the time. Now, maladaptive daydreaming means that you have started doing it habitually as a habit that could not be conscious. It could be a place that you default to as soon as you engage in any stress or boredom or any feelings that you're trying to avoid. And now you are so attached to the feeling of being in that fantasy world that it starts to become your default. You're just always going to it. And you may even start to feel like you're haunted or trapped by this fantasy world. Why? Well, you start to become attached to a lot of your fantasies. You might have stories, narratives about people or things that you want, or ideas about yourself that you really cling on to, but they are part of a fantasy. This daydreaming has created a world of its own, and because it is a pathway to alleviate your suffering, and it's bringing you entertainment, or at least getting rid of the pain of the current moment, those stories about yourself, about other people, start to become very appealing, very addictive. And so maladaptive daydreaming means that you have become dependent in some way. You're almost addicted to fantasizing, imagining, daydreaming. Yeah. And I'm sort of using them interchangeably. We will for now, because you could be doing one that leads to the other, or one could be supporting the other and creating the habit more long term. But there are distinctions. We won't overly focus on that right now. So how do you know that you're doing it? If you are spending excessive time daydreaming, it means you are becoming distracted from your work, from socializing, from looking after yourself, all things that you should be doing naturally, as part of living your life. But they are suddenly much more difficult because you get easily anxious, let's say, and you'd rather stay at home and just live in your head, basically. Or you are zoning out of conversations a lot, or you are not paying attention in times where you're supposed to be paying attention, such as in meetings. Now, this is not the only explanation as to why you do this, so don't get too alarmed if these things are happening to you. But I'm just saying that for someone who is engaging in maladaptive daydreaming, those might be some symptoms that they might be picking up on. Now, another thing is that you spend an incredible amount of time daydreaming. And the reason for that is, as we've discussed, it is better to live in that world, easier to live in that world than to live in the real world. That is what implicitly you have learned by becoming dependent on maladaptive daydreaming. So what happens once you realize this is something you're doing? You should seek professional help, and I will always say that social media will never be a replacement for therapy. So seek professional help if you feel like you need it. If you do notice that you are slipping into maladaptive daydreaming very often, the first thing I think might be helpful is to notice when you're doing it and see how fast you can catch yourself in that world. If you decide, hey, this fantasy world is not really motivating me in any significant way. It's taking way too much of my time. I'm using it as a way to self-soothe emotionally, basically, by going back into that fantasy again and again. And it's also turning into loads of weird, different stories about when this happens, I'll do this. When that happens, maybe I'll say that. Or I'll wait for her to say this to me and then I'll do that. And it's a lot of engineering, really, of what you want in order to get that hit, that emotional hit you feel you need. And suddenly this once enjoyable, casual exercise of daydreaming starts to become something that you rely on and you are wasting an incredible amount of time on. So when you realize that, the first thing to do is to be able to know when you're slipping into it. Start to make a note. When is it that you're doing it? Is it first thing in the morning? Is it when you're in meetings? Is it when you're hanging around with friends and you start to talk about certain topics? Do you not know at all when you start to slip into it? Maybe you just slip into it. So in those cases, you're going to have to start to think, okay, I don't know what on the outside is creating this change for me to need to go into this daydreaming world. But you might start to notice, how did I feel just before that? Was I starting to feel anxious? Was I starting to feel bored? Was I scared of something? Those feelings might be the thing that are triggering you to move into daydreaming. So that's one, is knowing when you're moving into it. The second thing is you might want to start to think about, why is it this content that you're daydreaming about? So daydreaming might be about specific areas in your life that you want to get better, or things that you want to develop in your own life. For example, some people do romantic ones. They might visualize the perfect partner or being with a specific person. It might be about your own successes and glory, something about you becoming a certain person. It might be about fictional characters. So looking at that content and starting to think, not too much, don't think too much about the daydreaming that you start to daydream more, of course, but if you can pull yourself out and kind of almost look at the daydreaming from a third person perspective and say, I tend to dream about these themes. I tend to daydream about these topics, these fictional people or these real people, and start to look at that and say, what is that trying to tell me? What is that doing for me, right? I feel better imagining about romantic partners because I find it stressful to actually engage with people and explore romantic partnerships with people. So you've learned something about what that daydreaming has done for you, and possibly how you might start to remedy it by saying, well, I'm going to challenge myself to get out there and start dating someone and not live in my head, even though that feels more comfortable right now. So acknowledging what makes you slip into it, what the contents are, and also just being objective and compassionate with yourself in the sense of, don't beat yourself up for being in this state. You can accept that that is where you are right now, but you can also commit to the fact that you do not want this to continue. And by committing, you're saying, I'm going to do this exercise of noting when I'm slipping in and what these fantasies have been doing for me, what pain have they been alleviating, what the themes are, and then saying, right, when I'm doing the daydreaming, I'm going to make sure I start noting down all the stuff we've spoken about so far. And then you're going to say, right, I know I'm feeling anxious. I know this daydreaming is pulling me away from that and trying to help me by not keeping me in that anxious place. What am I going to do as a result? You might say, I'm going to sit with the anxiety for a bit longer because I know that I can endure that. I don't need to run away as soon as things get difficult. Okay, so there'll be various degrees. Maybe your anxiety is very high, and this is why you should seek help if it is something that you need help managing. But if it's something that you think you can sit with a bit longer, you can start to teach yourself, hey, I don't need to immediately escape to the dreamland, right? I can sit with the anxiety a bit longer, and eventually, you can't panic forever with that thing that causes you anxiety. It's kind of like with phobias. One of the remedies for phobias is exposure therapy. It's not a very pleasant one, but the principle is the same in that someone who's scared of spiders might be put into a room with a lot of spiders in a safe way in that, maybe not with them crawling on you, but in a room with spiders, which would be wholly unacceptable for them in any other situation. But they have said, you know what, I'd rather not be scared of them for the rest of my life, so I'm just going to do this. And they do it. And the thing is, your body cannot keep you in that state of panic the whole time. So eventually your body just learns, okay, well, it's been 15 minutes in this room with spiders and nothing bad has happened. So I just don't have the energy to be stressed out anymore. It's similar here with the daydreaming. If you can figure out when you're slipping into it and say, it happens at these points and I'm doing it to remedy this feeling because the daydreaming gives me another feeling which is more pleasurable, then you can say, right, when I catch myself getting anxious, getting bored, whatever it is, I'm going to make sure I can sit with that for longer than I've been able to before. Yeah, and just challenge yourself. Just start a timer and say, I've realized I'm anxious, I've realized I'm bored. I'm going to start sitting with that 30 seconds, 1 minute, 2 minutes, see how long you can do it. Another way of dealing with it is, rather than sitting with it until the feeling starts to subside, so you break that association of going into the daydreaming, you can also create a behavior that you replace with it. So you might say, if I'm getting anxious and this is the kind of thing I would end up daydreaming about, I'll take 5 deep breaths with the box method, which is like a specific way of breathing. Just give yourself something clear that you can resort to instead of the daydreaming. Once you've done all the themes analysis and that stuff, to make sure that you're acquainted with why you've been resorting to this thing. So that's all I've got for the first video on this. Hopefully this is helpful. I found this area really interesting. Hopefully you did too. Remember, social media is not a replacement for therapy. Look after yourself.